Now this is going to be the outline of the body proportions exercise that I have in the class materials. And the point of the exercise isn't to nail down exactly the proportions of the human body, because everyone's body is going to be a little bit different. But by working with this exercise, students sort of can internalize the idea that there are consistent proportions to the body. And there's a printed handout here that really outlines it for you. And for the students, you can make copies of those. But today I don't have that with me, which is actually fine, because you don't have to have a printed resource. You don't even have to have something like a ruler. What I have here is an outline, an oval shape that I made based on my own first finger joint. And it's pretty well proportional to that in width and height. And that's one way that you can use that as a basis for creating the rest of the outlines of the proportions of the body, of the human skeleton. I'm doing this with a marker so that you'll be able to see better what I'm doing. There are different ways to go about this. You could use your finger as a guide, like a ruler, and do the exercise that way. You could use a ruler, you could use the printed resource, but what I have here, what I've done is I've made this and cut it out on a piece of paper like this. And if you have a regular piece of printer paper, I can just see that through the paper. And so I can use that as a way to, I can trace that and move it and use it as a guide. So that's what I'm going to do. And what we're going to do is to start out with a 8 heads high. We're going to use this as a unit and stack 8 of these heads together. And that's going to be the height of the skeleton. So we're talking about creating the skeleton that gives the body the proportions that it has. So there's one head, and I can move that down. And if you print these out, your students can cut them out themselves and make a guide that way. And I'm doing this very quickly. Your students would be doing this in pencil, and they can actually do it very lightly, because you really don't need to see all these ovals. And you're going to use these as a basis to create some other shapes. So there's the height of the body, and this is a proportion that goes way back to, gosh, the Egyptians and the Greeks and all kinds of people used that as a proportion. So using this same head proportion, if we turn it sideways, what you get if you have 2 heads laid horizontally together, you get something that approximates the width of the shoulders pretty well. So I'm going to trace one of those, and this is just sitting right above the line where there are 2 heads that meet. So if we take one oval or head proportion, and then another one right next to it, you have approximately the correct width of the shoulders. And if we move down again, so that's below the second level of the second head. If we go down 2 more and we stack 2 of these side by side vertically, so we're going to add this to that 4th level of the head proportion, you get a measurement that is very close to the actual size of the hip bone in the skeleton. And so if you look at your handout at the printed material, you'll see that we can start to use these as a basis for creating the other shapes of the body. So if I draw a triangle starting at the top of those 2 and going down between these 2 for the hips, this is about where the shoulders, the bones of the shoulders would join. And if you divide these into thirds, you're going to basically draw a rectangle here. That rectangle represents the hip bones, and if you use your thumbs and you put them up right on top and feel where your hip bones are, this is where those would be. So the legs would, the hip bones, or the top of the femur there, will join right here at the bottom of this box. So this is a good way to start building other relationships. So if you draw kind of a dotted line here, this will give you a good idea of the length of the upper arm bone. You could stop that right there. So this is going to be about the right length. And if you draw another line 5 heads down, this will take you to the tips of the fingers. So you'll have these two are about equal, the upper arm and the bottom, and then your wrist and your fingers, the palm of the hand. And this is true. If you put your arms at your sides, the tips of your fingers actually do come about halfway down your upper leg, your femur. Even though right now it looks a little bit out of place, but it's true. This also represents the proportion of the neck here, and you could bring that up this way. But that's more for kind of filling in the details. But then if you draw another imaginary line right here, so now we're down to 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 head lengths. If you draw another line just above there, this is right where the kneecap would sit on both sides. So this gives you then, from the bottom of this rectangle that represents the hip bone, you draw another triangle down to each of those kneecaps, and then straight down, and this is where your heel bone would be, and the feet. And of course this is all very general and crude, but these proportions are going to be pretty well correct for just about everybody, with some variations because we're all a little different. But you can get very close to the correct proportion of any one that you're looking at to draw by kind of following these guidelines. And of course you'll need to make adjustments if you're drawing a finished picture of somebody. But this is a very accurate, surprisingly accurate set of proportions. And if you were to lay a human skeleton over the top, it would be almost perfectly aligned to the human skeleton. So if I trace over these shapes now with and then leave out the unnecessary oval heads there, then I'll have something very much like an accurate human skeleton in the proportions. So I'm just tracing over where all these different breaks would be. Here's our hip bone. And the tops of the hip bones would be right there. Our kneecap. And you might have your students try and go through this exercise a couple of times so they start to get accustomed to these proportions and sort of like internalize them. So you can start asking yourself questions, or like, are these two equal? Are they equal to the proportions that I see in the upper body here? So you end up with something then like this. And this is something that you can use. The second half of the exercise is to take this set of proportions and then draw this in different positions, maybe add some imaginative details to it, but try to put this into a different situation, maybe an athlete or a dancer or who knows what, doing some sort of activity. And that calls on their imagination a little bit, makes it, again, something that they can start to internalize, even though using your imagination that way is kind of a difficult drill for some students. But this is how these proportions begin and end up.